You mention in the book that in many of your early relationships, you describe yourself as emotionally unavailable. So, what was the genesis of that unavailability, and how were you able to witness it and eventually address it?
I think the interesting thing about self-defining, defining, and a lot of that definition for me is now, from where I stand looking back, to be able to use a label like emotionally unavailable. Because quite honestly, the first time I heard that was after my first relationship. I was 16 years old when that ended, somewhere around like 17 and a half. My partner at the time, college was one of the main reasons that we had broken up, though he had cited that he felt me to be emotionally unavailable. And at that time, I felt dumbfounded at hearing that label applied to myself because I didn't feel, in any stretch of the word, emotionally unavailable. I felt a lot of emotions a lot of the time and a deep desire to be emotionally connected to those around me, which then sequentially going from serial monogamous relationship to next relationship, I was always trying to find that level of connection. Somewhere down the line, I would complain to the next partner, oh, I'm not feeling emotionally connected to you. And the relationship would ultimately end. Of course, I would assume or attribute the blame to the person. Oh, I picked the wrong person. They're not the ideal partner. It's something you're doing or not doing that's not giving me that feeling. So it took me until I was well into my 30s to begin to explore that label and why the second time I had heard it, I was in a training program to become a psychoanalyst. I had received my clinical degree and I was doing some of my postdoc hours at a psychoanalytic training institute. And one of the requirements is that you're in your own personal analysis. So laying on the couch, free associating. And we had a group similar experience. I would sit around the room with other analysts and just hear people share what was on their thoughts, their mind. And oftentimes what came up is their perception of you. And one of my colleagues at that time, now nearing into my 30s, and in this percolator of trying to understand myself better, had said to me or had described me as being, to her impression, cold and aloof. Now, here's the second time I'm hearing some version of me not emotionally giving off the feeling that I'm having inside to other people. And at that point in time, I didn't dismiss it as I did in my high school years. I looked at it. I thought, okay, what is going on here? Why does this map so, kind of right onto my own experience, which is I don't feel emotionally connected in relationships. What is going on here? Why are people perceiving me this way? And why am I experiencing my relationships this way? And I came to realize that it began, as I think all of our relational habits and patterns begin, in early childhood for me, where I absolutely had I had two present caregivers. My mom, though, was the core caregiver, stayed at home, raised me, took care of me in a physical sense, which is why for decades of life, I would have described my childhood as happy, healthy, and, nothing
Mm-hmm.
lacking in any way. What I came to realize wasn't present was that level of emotional or attunement or connection that we all need as children.
Yeah.
And as I started to learn more and more about the nervous system and the need for that safe point of co-regulation, and then the trauma and dysregulation that we can store in the body, in addition to our body's protective habits, which for me was disconnecting from
Mm.
myself emotionally. I call it in my first book, it felt to be like living on a spaceship, where I was
Right.
going about the daily habits quite well, quite impressively, achieving a lot of things, carrying on all these relationships. Yet I was a million miles away, almost outside of myself. So now I had a bit of understanding with why I was being experienced the way that I was, as emotionally unavailable, as distant to others, because I was so disconnected from my physical body where our emotions live. I was so overwhelmed with near constant stress. I couldn't navigate or tolerate my emotions. I was so focused on being what I call this concept of conditioned selves, of being
Mm-hmm.
this unburdensome, achievement driven person, that I did create that pattern in my relationships of emotional distance, while at the same time blaming everyone around me and looking for the person who would give me a different feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't it funny? We generally, when relationships aren't working, we generally are trying to foist the responsibility for change on the partner. And then every once in a while, we look back in at ourselves and be like, wait, I'm having the same relationship over and over again. who's the problem here? And sometimes those satori are hidden in plain sight. And I think you bring out that in the book, but it made me examine my own relationships, as well. I mean, do you feel that most unhealthy relationships generally have their root in these early childhood trauma or adverse experiences?
Every way we show up in relationship, predominantly or foundationally, I should say, our relationship with ourselves, how we imagine ourselves to be, how we feel about ourselves, how we care for our physical and emotional self. And then, of course, extending outward in terms of how we're showing up and relating to and connecting to those around us has our root in those earliest relationships. I do believe the large majority of us as adults, I like to joke that I'm looking for the unicorn who came from a securely attached childhood experience. And I joke, though, there's meaning in that because the generations that came before us, especially those of us in our adult years, were very limited. They were limited in access to information. I mean, I think about and talk about often the reality that parenting advice for decades focused just on keeping the children physically alive. There was no awareness of emotional needs or emotional connection or self-expression. So parents were doing what they were, many of them, taught to do, which is just tend to the physical needs of an infant, of a child, punish or reward their behavior, and not think about anything else. And then beyond that, all of the different, access or inaccess that has happened in terms of structural and political and, not having financial resources and having traumatic things happen to groups of people. So we all come from ancestors or lineages that I do not think has translated to very many of us, if at all, having modeled to us and experienced a safe and secure environment. So what we then do show up is in more dysfunctional or insecurely attached models of being, both to ourselves and to others.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I've often made this connection between, around like evolutionary mismatches, but mostly with physiological disease. So we have like an ancient genome, but then that's at odds with our modern culture. So that could be like the surfeit of shitty ultra-processed calories or whatever it is. And that we are simply not evolved to manage that aspect of like modern human artifice. But I haven't ever really made that direct connection I think that you're making, which I think is fascinating, which is there is also an evolutionary mismatch with how our relationships function, where, in hunter-gatherer days, there's an African parable, like it takes a village to raise a child, right? Well, that's actually rooted in something that actually was true, that the necessity of the tribe, instantiated this group child rearing process. And through that, we likely had, a feeling of greater safety and security such that we could be our authentic selves. And now like we live in these little boxes and we've sanctified individualism and, such that, the stresses of raising children, have created, I think, what you're pointing to with is an evolutionary mismatch where, so many of us, and I raise my hand, have to really do these deep inventory and work to kind of unpack some of these pathologies around our relationships. So it's fascinating. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.